Hi everybody, welcome to today's story time. We are reading the book A Locket of Love. It's the second book in the Universal series and we are up to chapter 3, From One Reality to the Next. Patch has decided to join us too. As Molly's mum pulled into the driveway of the house, before the car had even come to a halt, Molly's car door was open as she was quickly trying to unclip her seatbelt. Molly jumped out of the car as it came to a stop and ran through the front door, up the stairs and into her bedroom. After a few moments, Molly's mum made her way through the front door and closed it behind her. She headed along the hallway to the kitchen, where she found Molly's dad finishing making the dinner. "How was your day?" he asked as he made his way over to the kitchen table, placing the knives and forks in front of the 3 chairs. "Same old. I wish she wasn't so stubborn and would just get someone in to help her full time. Oh, and the best bit is, she's been filling Molly's head with the wacky stories again," Molly's mum said as she filled the kettle to make a cup of tea. Molly's dad made his way back to the cooker, where he started to dish out the dinner. "That bad, eh?" he said as he took the first plate to the table. "Yes, and the worst of it is, I think Molly believes her," Molly's mum said as she stood waiting for the kettle to boil. "I'm sure it's not that big of a deal. It will be like everything else. She will stop believing in those silly stories the older she gets," he said, placing his hand on her shoulder as he passed her. "I hope so," Molly's mum said as she's finishing making her tea and went to sit down at the table, staring into her cup of tea, lost in thought. Molly's dad brought the last 2 plates across and placed them on the table before heading down the hallway. "Molly, dinner's ready," he shouted from the bottom of the stairs before making his way back into the kitchen and sitting at the table. They heard Molly bound down the stairs, her footsteps making a jolly beat as she appeared in the kitchen doorway and joined her parents at the table, her chair screeching on the floor as she dragged it out to sit on it. "How was your day?" Molly's mum asked Molly's dad, as Molly quietly ate in the background. Something wasn't right, she thought. Something didn't feel right. Molly decided to eat her dinner as quickly as possible and get back to her bedroom without drawing any attention to herself. "It was good," Molly's dad replied. "They have asked me if I want to move to another part of the company," he said as he filled his mouth full of food. "Oh, right. Is there any talk of a pay rise?" Molly's mum asked him as she poked the food around on a plate with her fork. "Not yet, but I think the move will give me the opportunity," he said, looking at her. Suddenly, Molly's mum's fork dropped to the plate. As it hit the plate, the noise rang in Molly's ears. "Thank you for dinner, Dad," Molly said, getting up quickly from the table. "You haven't finished your dinner," he said. "Not hungry," Molly said, dashing to the stairs and running up to her bedroom, trying to escape the wrath of the storm that was building in the house. Just as Molly reached her bedroom and was closing the door, she heard her mum from downstairs begin yelling. "You said this was only going to be temporary," Molly's mum screamed. "We can't keep living like this," she shouted as Molly heard her mum slam the plate into the sink. Molly made her way across her bedroom to the windowsill. It had just started to get dark. As the sun was setting, the stars began to emerge in the sky. Molly took the blanket that was laying on the floor and pulled herself up onto the windowsill. She wrapped herself in the blanket and closed the curtains in the hope that she would turn invisible. As she sat in her cocoon, she continued to watch the night sky grow darker and darker as the sun completely disappeared behind a row of houses. Staring at the stars, making different pictures and patterns from them, she wished she could be amongst them, away from all the anger that filled the house. Her gaze fell on one star in particular. It wasn't necessarily the brightest, but Molly thought it was the most beautiful star out of all of them. As she let out a large sigh, she remembered Nana Rose's words. "Love is the answers, wishes come true, as you remember the place that connects me and you." Molly looked at the stars and she said, "How did she know what I was thinking? How is it that when I am with her, anything feels possible? And what was that feeling I had downstairs that told me I needed to get back to my room?" The star continued to glisten in the sky. Molly pulled the blanket more tightly around her, feeling more alone than ever. As Molly sat there in silence, the tears began to flow. She hated everyone being so angry all the time. All the grown-ups getting up in the morning, rushing to get out the door. Then when they come home, just talking about how rubbish their day has been. Then going up to bed feeling miserable. Is this really how life is supposed to be? Is this the only reason we are here? Molly buried her head in her blanket. None of it made sense to her, and she just couldn't believe that this was the way life was meant to be. As the tears continued to flow, everything went quiet downstairs, and then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Molly's head shot up. She flew from behind the curtains back into her bedroom, running across to her bed and diving under the duvet, pulling it right up around her ears so no one could see her, lying perfectly still. Molly heard the bedroom door creak open. "Molly? Are you awake?" she heard her mum whisper. Molly lay motionless, holding her breath, trying to pretend she was fast asleep. After a few moments, Molly heard the door click close and footsteps going back down the stairs. She let out a large sigh and then took a big breath in. She still didn't dare open her eyes. As she lay there, she carried on thinking about the day she had had at Nana Rose, and she began to relax as her body melted into her bed. Just as Molly was about to fall fast asleep, she thought she heard an owl hoot just outside her window. She managed a weak smile. "Night-night, Nana Rose," she murmured. And then she was asleep. The next morning, Molly woke to the noise of her parents rushing around the house getting ready for work. As she slowly opened her eyes, allowing them the chance to adjust to the sunlight, her door was pushed open and her mum whirled into the room. "Molly, come on, wake up, we're late, we're overslept the alarm clock," Molly's mum said with panic in her voice. Molly felt the cool rush wash over her body as the duvet was pulled back and the weight of the school uniform as they were thrown over her legs. Molly's mum disappeared out of the bedroom and stomped down the stairs, heading into the kitchen to put on some toast for breakfast. Molly dragged her sleepy body to an upright position and began to peel her pyjamas off, wishing she could stay asleep where she was having the most incredible dream. "Come on, Molly, breakfast is ready," Molly's mum bellowed from the bottom of the stairs. Just as the doorbell rang, Molly's mum spun round and flung the front door open, and there stood Molly's best friend, Layla. "She's just coming," Molly's mum said whilst gathering up her things for work. "Okay," Layla said, confused, wondering where the fire was. "I'll be down in a minute," a voice called from the top of the stairs. Moments later, a more awake Molly came bounding down the stairs, running over to Layla, giving her a hug, then grabbing her school coat and her toast her mum was thrusting at her. Layla picked up Molly's school bag by the front door. They were scooted out the door and into the morning air. Molly shivered as a cool autumn breeze blew and she zipped up her coat. "Have a great day," Molly's mum said, kissing Molly on the top of her head and dashing to her car. "Bye, Layla," she said. Layla was about to say bye, but the car door was already shut and Molly's mum began to drive back out of the drive. Molly took the toast she was holding and started nibbling on it as they walked. As the two girls walked along the path towards school, Layla began to tell Molly what she had been up to over the weekend, whilst she watched Molly eating her breakfast. "You'll never believe what happened. It was the funniest thing I have ever seen," Layla said, flailing her arms around and hitting Molly in the process with Molly's school bag that she was still holding. Molly coughed, grabbing her school bag and flinging it over her shoulder. "Why, what happened?" Molly asked with a mouthful of toast. "Dad was trying to fix the garden seat, which is next to the pond, and as he was pulling on something to try and get it off, it broke and he went flying into the pond. He smelled so bad afterwards, and Mum was trying to help him out, but she couldn't because she was laughing too hard. Me and Amy got it on our phones," Layla said, beginning to chuckle as she relived the memory. "I thought Amy was at her mum's this weekend," Molly asked, bewildered. "She was, but they had a big argument and so she came back early. Dad just kept quiet. He says there is no point jumping into a pit full of angry lionesses," Layla said, rolling her eyes. "Anyway, how was Nana Rose?" Layla asked. "Was it as horrible as you thought it would be?" "At least it's done now. You don't have to go for another year," Layla said, trying to put a positive spin on it. "I'm going back tomorrow," Molly said, plunging her hands into her pockets and looking straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with Layla. "What?" Layla exclaimed. All last week you were moaning and moaning and moaning about going to see her. What happened to change your mind? They approached the school gates just as the bell rang for the first class. As they walked across the playground, they became engulfed in a swarm of other children who were all heading for the school building. Well, it was dead weird, Molly began. What was weird? A familiar voice asked from behind them. They turned round to see Dylan standing there. He moved in closer, draping his arms casually across the two girls' shoulders. Layla proceeded to push his arm off as if he was a bad lingering smell. Molly actually liked going to see her Nana O and is going again tomorrow, Layla explained. What? Seriously? Dylan said. After all the complaining I did, I get it. But things change. Molly snapped back in anger and stormed into the school building. Layla and Dylan turned and looked at each other in disbelief. What was that all about? Dylan asked. Your guess is as good as mine, Layla replied, looking bewildered. They followed the direction Molly had headed down the corridor. They reached the classroom door and made their way in for registration. Dylan and Layla pulled an empty chair out as they sat down either side of Molly. Layla quietly began to take out her books and pencil case. Dylan stared at both of them as they sat in silence. Well, I don't mind asking, what the hell was that all about, Molly? Molly didn't reply, but continued to stare blankly at the front of the class. Dylan looked across to Layla for support, but Layla just shrugged her shoulders. You girls are complicated, Dylan concluded. They heard the classroom door close behind them and the teacher's footsteps made their way to the front of the class as the lesson began. Molly looked around the classroom and up at the clock, only 55 minutes until break. As she looked around at everyone sitting behind their desk, listening to the teacher speak, she could hear nothing. Everything looked so out of place. She felt so out of place. Molly glanced back at the clock, 54 minutes to go. She let out a large sigh as her head fell onto her folded arms, which were placed on the desk in front of her. Is there something wrong? A voice asked from the front of the room. Molly heard the teacher's footsteps get closer. Molly slowly lifted her head and began to rub her forehead as thousands of thoughts bounced around in her mind. I'm not feeling so good. Could I go outside and get some fresh air? Molly asked, still staring at the desk. Yes, of course, but if you feel unwell, you should go and see the school nurse, the teacher said, making her way to the front of the class. Molly couldn't find it in her to even reply. She slowly pushed the chair back, ignoring Layla and Dylan, motioning to explain what was wrong, and made her way out of the classroom door. As she stepped out into the school corridor and closed the door behind her, she leant against the wall and looked up to the ceiling. Why do I feel so weird? Molly said out loud as two children walked past, staring strangely at her. Molly pushed herself off the wall and made her way back to the playground, where she walked across the playing field to the nearest tree and sat down. Suddenly she let out a sigh of relief. As she felt free once more, Molly closed her eyes and her thoughts began to settle. But then the questions began. What was that all about? Why do I feel so weird? What really happened at Nana Rose? Molly opened her eyes and then closed them again, pulling her knees up to her chest. She was suddenly brought back to reality as she felt a hand on her shoulder. Molly's eyes shot open to see Layla and Dylan crouched down beside her. She then became aware of the noise of the children playing as she looked around the playing field, which was now filled with children. Molly looked at Dylan and Layla. Is it break time already? Molly stuttered. Yep, you were gone for quite some time. The teacher's going to send out a search party, Layla said softly. I must have lost track of time, Molly said, looking around and still taking in her surroundings. We're more worried, Molly. What's up with you? You've been acting really strange, Dylan said, concerned. Molly pulled her body into a seated position. As she leant against the tree, she looked at Dylan, then at Layla. Both were no longer smiling. Something happened when I visited Nana O. I don't understand what it is yet, but I know things have changed. I'm different. It feels like I'm remembering something. Nana O said something about me not being ready to receive, but I am now, Molly Molly said, rubbing her eyes, trying to make sense of it all. Why? What happened? Layla said as she sat down, positioning herself by Molly's side. You can tell us. We already know you're weird, Dylan said, trying to lighten the mood as he moved round to the other side of Molly. He felt Layla's hand tap him on the back of his head. Shut up, Dylan, Layla said protectively. Molly looked out onto the school playing fields, focusing on the other children running round and playing, oblivious to it all. Molly looked at Layla and then at Dylan, who were both sitting there staring at her, their gaze not shifting until she told them both what had happened that weekend at Nana Rose. Molly stared down at her feet. It's nothing really, she began. Really, Layla said sarcastically. Okay, maybe it was something, but I just can't seem to make sense of it. I just have a feeling in my stomach that something bad is going to happen, or that something isn't right, Molly said, rubbing her forehead again. Well, maybe we can figure out why you feel this way together, Dylan said encouragingly. As Molly was just about to say the first word, the school bell rang. Molly breathed a sigh of relief. We'd best get to class, she said, standing up from under the tree. She gathered her coat and bag that Layla and Dylan had brought out with them. Stupid bell, Dylan said in frustration. You can tell us the full story at lunch then, Molly, Layla said, determined that whatever was bothering Molly would be known to her by the end of the day. Sure, whatever, Molly said, shrugging her shoulders and setting off to walk back to the school building to her next class. Molly made her way into the school building, heading up the stairs towards the next class when a boy came racing down the stairs. He flew round the corner with one hand on the banister to stop himself from falling forward when he ran headfirst into Molly. The two of them collided and went flying as they bashed and bumped down the stairs to the floor. As they landed in a heap, the boy quickly got up, brushed himself down and said, "Wake up, would you?" as he took off at a run. Layla and Dylan just stood at the bottom of the stairs in disbelief at what they had just seen. Layla snapped out of her trance and reached down to help Molly to her feet. "Are you all right?" Layla asked. "I think so," Molly said, dusting herself off. Dylan stood there looking at them both as his face turned from disbelief to confusion. "Wake up? That's weird. Normally you would say sorry, not wake up," he said, playing the words over and over again in his mind. Molly turned and looked at him. "What did you just say?" she asked, now fully alert. The boy who just knocked you flying, he said, "Wake up, would you?" "Normally you would say sorry or something," Dylan said, staring intently at Molly. Molly stood there storming at Dylan, becoming annoyed as the anger and confusion of everything filled every cell of her body. She began to think of all the illusions that filled her life, all the lies and the deceit. Molly stormed up the stairs with each footstep sounding like thunder as it echoed around the stairway. Molly marched into class, walking straight past the teacher to where she would normally sit at the back of the class. She slammed her bag on the table, causing everyone to turn and look at her. Layla walked in. "I wouldn't mess with her today. Someone has just sent her flying down the stairs," she said as she made her way to her seat. The teacher looked up at Molly. "Are you hurt? Do you need to go and see the nurse?" "I'm fine," Molly snapped back. The teacher stood tall as he slowly made his way to the door. He turned to look at Molly. "I think you'd better wait outside," he said, pointing outside the classroom door. "Sir, I haven't done anything wrong," Molly pleaded. "Just wait outside," the teacher replied. The class fell silent as Molly picked up her school bag and walked between the tables to the classroom door. She continued to look at the floor. As she went out into the corridor, the teacher slowly closed the door behind her and Molly listened as she heard the click. Molly looked up and down the corridor. No one was there. Molly slung her school bag over her shoulder and began to make her way back to the stairs. "What is the point of sticking around? He won't listen to me anyway," Molly mumbled to herself. As she went down the stairs, she heard the classroom door above her open. She quickened her pace and just made it outside as she heard the teacher call her name. Molly sprinted across the playground back to the tree she had been sitting under with Layla and Dylan. As she reached the tree, she leant over, trying to catch her breath. Molly lowered herself to the ground, took off her school bag, leant her back and head against the tree and closed her eyes. She felt a stillness descend over her body as her eyes and everything turned black. As the moments went by, Molly felt her heartbeat and breathing slow down. As she opened her eyes, the sun appeared from behind a cloud, showering her in sunlight. Molly let out a sigh. It felt so warm, so safe here. Molly looked around and there was no one to be seen. She took hold of her school bag and opened it, taking out one of the school exercise books and pencil case. Molly placed the bag down in front of her and opened the book to a blank page. Then, reaching to take a pen from her pencil case, she began to write. The words flowed like a river onto the page as she wrote down what had happened at her Nana Rose's house. The door seemingly opening by itself, the room looking different as Nana Rose began to tell the story of the locket. As she reached the point where the story began, Molly's pen froze in its position. "Am I not just imagining all this?" she whispered to herself. Molly stared at the empty line on the page and then began to write the story. Molly sat under the tree in the sunshine as the pen flew across the page. She filled each line with words, the story beginning to build line by line as she retold the story of the locket. Molly could hear the playing field begin to fill with children once more as the class had finished and lunchtime had arrived. Layla and Dylan appeared as they stepped out of the school building, scanning the playing field for Molly. "There she is," Dylan said, pointing at the tree. They began to make their way over in silence. "Hey, what happened? Sir is furious," Layla shouted as she got nearer to where Molly was sitting. Molly didn't look up but continued to write. "What are you doing?" Dylan asked as they reached Molly and stood looking down at her, scribbling as fast as she could onto the pages. Dylan tilted his head to try and read what she was writing upside down. His eyes began to focus as he saw the word poo. He said the word aloud and then, "What are you writing?" again trying to hide a giggle inside as he thought about the word poo. Molly carried on writing, ignoring Dylan's comment. Layla lowered herself to the ground in front of Molly. "You said you were going to tell us what happened at Nana Rose," Layla said softly. Layla recalled the memory of the last time she saw Molly acting like this was when her parents had an argument where plates were smashed and the house looked like a war zone. Were the only words Molly spoke. "Then tell us," Layla said reassuringly. Molly looked up at Layla and lowered the pen to the ground where it laid in the grass. She handed the book in which she had been writing to Layla. Layla smiled as she took hold of the book and began to flip through the pages to where Molly had begun to write. Molly leant back against the tree and looked up at the blue sky which had developed as all the clouds had dissolved away whilst she had been writing. "What does it say?" Dylan asked, just before he took a bite out of his sandwich and he had got out of his bag. Layla looked up from the pages looking at Dylan and then at Molly. Molly continued to look up at the blue sky. "It's a story about a locket," Layla said, trying to hide the confusion in her voice. "Well, go on, read it out," Dylan said with a mouthful of sandwich, some of it flying out of his mouth and landing on the pages. "That's disgusting, Dylan," Layla said, wiping it off her sleeve. "Didn't your parents tell you not to speak with your mouth full?" she said in protest. "All the time," Dylan smiled, taking another bite. Layla readjusted herself to get comfy and laid the book on her lap. "It says the story began. Layla, Dylan and Molly sat under the tree as Layla read out the story of the locket that Molly had heard the day before at Nana Rose. As Layla read out loud the last word, "Love is the answer, wishes come true, as you find the place that connects me and you." They all sat there silently for a moment contemplating the words. "What does it mean? Answer to what? Is the lock magical? How did your Nana Rose know what you were thinking? Is that the end of the story? Do you think this has something to do with the funny feelings you got before you got ploughed down the stairs?" Layla said, reeling question after question off as she sat trying to make sense of it all. "Now do you see why I've been acting weird all morning?" Molly said, raising her arms to the sky. "I get it," Dylan said, now lying on the ground. Molly and Layla shot him a look of disbelief. "Out of all of us, you're the first to get it," Molly said dismissively. "It's easy. I can't believe you guys don't get it," Dylan said confidently. Molly and Layla looked at each other as they heard the bell sound for the end of lunch. Dylan shot to his feet, grabbing his things and walking with a fast pace across the playing fields. Molly and Layla grabbed their bags. Molly shoved her school exercise book and pencil case back into her bag as she walked, chasing Dylan. "Aren't you going to tell us?" Layla shouted to Dylan. "Nope," Dylan replied as he broke out into a run, heading back to the school building. Molly and Layla started to run, trying to catch Dylan up before he disappeared into his next class. "Dylan, wait, would you?" Molly shouted. They heard Dylan begin to laugh as he reached the door and disappeared into the school building. Molly and Layla finally caught up with Dylan, who had already taken his seat in the classroom. Layla and Molly walked across the room and sat at the empty table in front of him. Layla placed her school bag on the table and turned round, glaring at Dylan. Neither of them said a word as they continued their staring match, wondering who would be first to break. Molly chuckled as she began to take her school exercise book out of her bag. "Is there a problem, Layla?" the teacher called across the room. Layla swung round in her chair to face the front. "No, miss. Shall we begin then?" the teacher said, motioning to the board. "Yes, miss," Layla said, lowering her school bag to the floor. "Ha ha, I won," Dylan said with glee as he leant forward across the table. "Dylan, have you got something you wish to share with us?" the teacher asked, beginning to get frustrated with the interruption. "No, miss," he said, leaning back in his chair. Layla turned round to Dylan with a wide grin and stuck out her tongue in jest. Dylan responded by motioning with his hand for her to turn back round to face the front. Molly was distant again through the whole class, but this time she wasn't alone. All three of them sat in total silence as they thought about the story and what the message in the locket meant. Love is the answer, wishes come true, as you find the place that connects me and you. Molly couldn't concentrate. She just kept doodling in her book as her mind wandered. Layla looked up at the classroom clock as she watched the hands move closer and closer to break time. 60 seconds, 40 seconds, 25 seconds. Ring! As the bell for break called. Dylan and Layla scooped up their belongings. "Molly, come on, it's break," Layla said, tapping Molly on the shoulder. Molly jumped out of her daydream. She turned to look at Layla as she blinked and her eyes began to focus again. "Where were you?" Dylan said jokingly. "I don't know, but it's that same dream I had last night," Molly said as she began to gather her things. "What dream?" Layla said, confused, curious to see if this was the next clue to the puzzle. They began to walk out of the classroom and into the corridor. As they neared the school building doors, they looked out of the window to see dark grey clouds building. They watched them move closer and closer as there was a large rumble of thunder and a storm approached. "That's odd," Dylan said, staring intently at the storm. "It was beautiful sunshine and blue sky earlier on. We might as well go and sit in the cafeteria where you can tell us about your dream," Layla said, looking at Molly. "Can't we just go and sit at the bottom of the stairs?" Molly said, pointing at where she had fallen earlier that day. They turned and made their way back to the staircase, where they settled down on the steps. Dylan and Layla stayed quiet as they waited for Molly to share her dream. "I know it might sound strange, but I saw this storm coming," Molly began, looking out of the window. Layla and Dylan glanced at each other but said nothing. "In my dream, there was a storm whilst we were at school, and lightning struck the school building, causing a power failure. They had to send us home early, but in front of the storm flew an owl, and when I was in the dream, I had the same feeling I had last night and this morning," Molly said. Layla and Dylan looked out of the window and all they could see was the storm gathering momentum, getting closer and closer. "There's no owl there, Molly," Layla said softly. "Maybe you're just tired," she said sympathetically. "No, I'm not. I just had the same dream in class that I dreamt about last night. Of all things I could dream about, why the heck would I dream about that?" Molly said, looking down at her hands. "I'm not crazy, you know," Molly said quietly. "Well, this is the most excitement we've had in months," Dylan said, moving to the edge of the step in eagerness. "Are you going to tell us what the note in the locket meant now, Dylan?" Molly asked sweetly. "Oh, I haven't the foggiest. I was just making that up to see your two's reaction." Suddenly he felt Layla's hand tap him on the back of his head again. "What was that for?" he said, rubbing his head. That's for talking rubbish, and this is for lying to Molly. As she lifted her hand up, Dylan already knew what was going to happen, and he ducked his head. Maybe Nana was just making up stories to make the visit more exciting, Molly said, interrupting Layla and Dylan's play fight. Her stories have never been made you act like this before. I think it means more, but if it doesn't, it sure makes school more interesting trying to figure it out, Dylan said, getting serious. They heard the bell ring, signalling the end of break time. They all rose from the steps. As they did, another rumble of thunder roared and flashed of lightning beamed in the distance. They all looked at each other in disbelief. It's really far away, Layla said, trying not to freak out. I'm not so sure, Dylan said, frozen to the spot. We'd best get to class, Molly said, not fazed at all by what was happening, but instead feeling pleased that it wasn't just weird things happening with her imagination. Molly made her way into the corridor with Layla and Dylan following behind. As they walked along, they could hear the thunder all around as the storm was now over the school. As they reached the classroom door, there was an almighty bang as the corridor lights flickered and then darkness descended. Layla leapt to Dylan's side, wrapping her arms around his waist. Oh, so now you like me, he said, wrapping his arms around her to protect her. Shut up, Dylan, Layla said in fear. Molly stopped in her tracks, looking all around, and said nothing. As she walked into the classroom, through the windows, she could see the storm clouds rolling in the sky. Layla and Dylan quickly followed behind, glad to be out of the dark corridor. They made their way to where Molly was standing, staring out of the window. I think I might need to get a clean pair of pants, Dylan said, pretending to cross his legs in fear. The teacher marched into the classroom, not bothered to close the door, holding a piece of paper in his hand. Everyone, can you take your seats quickly? He said as he moved to the front of the classroom. Right, the good news is the lightning only struck the generator. The bad news is you all get to go home early. The classroom erupted into cheer. The teacher began waving his arms to signal for everyone to be silent. Hang on, I've not finished, he shouted over the cheering. So the school buses are on their way. If for any reason you can't go home early, then you're to head to the hall. For the rest of you, we'll see you tomorrow. The teacher turned on his heels and headed back out of the classroom. You can have more of those dreams, Dylan said, squeezing Molly tight. Molly managed to give a weak smile. Do you two want to come back to mine and hang out? Layla said. Molly nodded her head and started to head out of the classroom. Layla grabbed Dylan's arm as he began to follow Molly. Do you know what's going on with Molly? She whispered. Not the foggiest, but I do know Molly needs us more than ever. The direction of Molly. Layla jogged to catch up. Did I see a glimpse of your caring side, Layla said, part sarcastically and part in awe. No, it was just your imagination, he said, grinning with enthusiasm. They caught up with Molly, who was standing at the door leading to the playing fields. She pulled her hood over her head. Ready? She asked Layla and Dylan. Dylan proceeded to pull his coat zip up right to the top. Ready, he said. Molly pushed open the door and a wave of cool, fresh air and lashing rain hit her face. They broke out into a run in the direction of the school gates. As they ran across the playing field, the wet ground squelching under their feet, they reached the pavement where they ran along until they got to the bend in the road. Stop, stop, Molly and Dylan heard Layla cry from behind. It stopped raining, and I can't run any more, she said, coming to a stop whilst trying to catch her breath. Molly hadn't noticed the rain had stopped and the blue sky had arrived. As they all came to a stop, Molly turned round to look back at the school, which now had a rainbow across the top of it. Look, she said to Layla and Dylan, pointing at the school building. Dylan turned round as Layla came back to an upright position. The three of them stood as they admired the full rainbow before them. That's incredible, Dylan said, finally breaking the silence. They turned and carried on making their way towards Layla's house. None of them spoke as they were trying to figure out the strange coincidences that had been happening all day. As they walked around the next corner, Layla's house came into sight. No cars were on the driveway. My parents will be back at 6 p.m, so we'll have the house to ourselves, Layla said, as she started to fumble through her back for the door key. As they walked up the driveway, they were greeted by Layla's cat, Duke, who started to weave through their legs. Layla bent down and scooped him up into her arms. He continued to climb until he was up on her shoulders. I'm sure your cat thinks it's a parrot, Dylan said, reaching up and stroking Duke's head as he began to purr. Layla put the key in the front door, unlocked it and pushed it open. Duke leapt off her shoulder, landed in the hallway and started to make his way to the kitchen. The three of them followed on behind, leaving their school bags by the door as they slipped off their shoes. They made their way through to the kitchen where Molly sat down at the table. Dylan headed straight for her fridge. Does anyone want a snack? He said, with his head inside the fridge. Make yourself at home, why don't you? Layla said in jest. Don't mind if I do, Dylan replied in a jingle. Do you want a cup of tea? Layla asked, looking at Molly. Molly was just staring out at the patio windows blankly, stroking Duke, who had now settled on her lap. Molly? Layla said, but there was still no reply. Dylan took the sandwich he had just been making across the table where Molly was sitting. As he passed her, he waved his hand in front of her face. Earth to Molly, he said. Molly suddenly looked up at Dylan. Sorry, I was miles away, she said, shuffling in her seat. Duke stood up and circled round before returning to a lying position where he closed his eyes again. Tea? Layla asked, raising up the kettle she was holding in her hand. Molly just nodded. Molly rested her head on her hand and went back to staring out of the patio window. Layla made her way across the table with 2 cups of tea, placing one in front of Molly and one in front of Dylan. Molly wrapped her hands around the warm mug, feeling the warmth travel up through her hands, up her arms and into her heart. It felt like her heart was receiving a hug. I'm not going to school tomorrow, Molly said, staring into her cup of tea. Layla came back across with her cup of tea and pulled out a chair opposite Molly. What are you going to say to your mum? Dylan asked through a mouthful of sandwich. Dylan, Layla cried, wiping a piece of cheese off her top that had proceeded to fly out of Dylan's mouth as he spoke. Dylan chuckled and took another bite. I'm going to say I'm not feeling well. It's sort of true. I'm definitely not feeling myself. Then I can go and see Nana O, Molly said, taking a sip of tea and feeling the hug extend from her heart to her whole body. Do you think she'll tell you the rest of the story, or do you think she will have forgotten? She is pretty old, Dylan said, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. Molly smiled. She said she isn't old, just wiser. And I want to know how it ends. Maybe then we will understand the note in the locket. You must call us as soon as you get back. Better still, we'll come round after school to check you're all right. Then you can tell us, Layla said, as her mind continued to formulate a plan. They all fell back into silence, lost in their thoughts. Say the message is true and your Nana O is right and wishes do come true. What would you wish for? Dylan said. Layla and Molly turned to look at Dylan. Wow, Dylan, that was quite an intelligent question. Maybe you're coming down with something, Layla said sarcastically. Dylan glared at Layla. I don't know. At the moment, I think if I could have one wish, it would be to understand what this is, this feeling I get when something isn't right, the dream of the storm. It must be connected somehow, Molly said, looking at Layla and Dylan for answers. I'd wish for a new bike, Dylan said, slurping his tea. Duke interrupted them with a meow as he stretched out his front legs. I think Duke would wish for an endless supply of tuna, Dylan laughed. They all broke out into laughter at the thought of Duke sitting on a mountain made of tins of tuna. I think I would wish for unlimited clothes and shopping, Layla said, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the clothes she could go out and get. Then I would have to totally revamp my room because I would need the world's largest wardrobe to put them all in. Molly began to laugh. What's so funny? Layla asked as Dylan began to join in, laughing too. Miss Barbie over there, he said, trying to hold back the giggles, nodding his head towards Layla. Layla stuck out her tongue at him and reached for her tea. As they sat at the table, Layla and Dylan got lost in their conversation, having a competition of who could come up with the craziest, most outrageous wish. Molly sat listening to the wish tennis match between the two of them. She looked down at Duke, who lay on her lap. As she began to stroke him, her mind relaxed, and she felt such warmth and love coming from him. As the empty cups sat on the table, they heard the front door open. "Hello?" Layla's mum shouted as she appeared at the kitchen door. "Oh, hi everyone," she said, lifting the bags of shopping onto the kitchen worktop. "Hi Mum," Layla said, getting up and walking across to her mum. As she reached her, she wrapped her arms around her, and her mum bent over and kissed her on the forehead. "Are you all staying for dinner?" Layla's mum asked, with one arm still wrapped around Layla. "No, thank you. I'd best be making tracks. I'm not feeling so good," Molly said, getting up from the kitchen table. Duke meowed in protest at the being disturbed from his sleep as he jumped from her lap to the floor. "Oh, do you want some medicine?" Layla's mum asked, concerned. "No, thanks. I'm just going to head home and get an early night," Molly said as she saw Layla give her a wink. "I'd best be off too, otherwise I'll be late for dinner," Dylan said. "But you've only just eaten," Layla said in disbelief. "I'm a growing man," Dylan said, patting his stomach. Layla responded by raising her eyebrows at him. "Very well," Layla's mum said, starting to unpack the shopping. Dylan and Molly made their way to the front door, where they put on their shoes and collected their school bags. Layla opened the front door. As they looked out, they saw the sun beginning to set on the horizon as dusk arrived. "See you tomorrow," Layla said, hugging Molly. "Yep," Molly replied quickly and made her way outside. Dylan moved in for a hug. "No chance," Layla said, pushing him out of the door. Dylan pretended to look sad. "Bye, Dylan," Layla said playfully as she closed the front door. Molly and Dylan walked down the driveway. As they reached the road, Molly slowed down. "See you tomorrow," she said, giving Dylan a hug. "You betcha," Dylan said as he squeezed her. They set off in opposite directions back home. Molly walked as the blanket of the night sky followed the setting sun. Molly let out a groan as the tiredness of the day set in. As she crossed the road, she looked up to see her house there in front of her. She turned and looked back, realizing she had been in a daydream the whole way home, not remembering getting there. She made her way up to the front door. As she turned the handle and made her way in, she threw her school bag on the floor, heading straight upstairs to her room. Her mum and dad watched her from the living room. "Are you all right, Molly?" Molly's dad asked. "I'm not feeling well. I'm going to bed. See you in the morning," she said quietly and disappeared upstairs. As Molly reached her bedroom, she flopped on her bed and groaned again as she pulled her duvet up over her, disappearing from sight. She listened as she heard footsteps up the stairs. "Please, just leave me alone," Molly began to repeat to herself. Molly heard the footsteps walk across the landing and into her room as the floorboards creaked. Then she heard the rings from the curtains slide across the curtain pole. The footsteps became louder as they neared where she was lying. She felt a kiss on top of her head. "Night," her dad said, then turned and made his way out of her bedroom, closing the door behind him. Molly listened as the footsteps got fainter and her eyelids got heavier. Sleep finally took over her body and she drifted off into the land of dreams. Well, we'll go and see Nana tomorrow, and we're on chapter 4, The Tale Becoming More Than a Story.